They appeared without warning, flickering, pulsing, and hovering above the dark ridge. The lights turned the stillness of the Ozark night into something unforgettable. The year was 1898. Millstone Ridge was then an obscure stretch of woodland and farmland where life followed its predictable rhythm. Sunrise meant labor in the fields. Sunset meant quiet dinners with family, and nights were long, silent stretches under a canopy of stars. In such a place nothing ever truly changed, until one particular autumn evening shattered the calm forever. It began with silence, not the ordinary silence of night, but something heavier, more deliberate, as though the land itself was holding its breath. People later recalled how the air felt different, charged, prickling on their skin as if before a storm, though the skies were clear. Cicadas stopped humming. Dogs grew restless, pacing, then grew strangely quiet. Farmers on their porches looked at each other, puzzled yet uneasy, because they had all noticed it at once. Then came the glow, at first faint and far away, like a lantern hidden deep within the woods. But soon it brightened, rising slowly above the tree line of Millstone Ridge. One light became two, two became three, until half a dozen luminous orbs hovered silently in the sky. Their colors shifted in strange patterns, sometimes a pale, steady white, sometimes flickering into crimson, and then sliding into an eerie green not known in lantern flames or natural fire. The movement was deliberate, almost playful. The orbs drifted slowly at first, gliding above the ridge as though surveying the land. Then, without warning, they darted in erratic bursts, zigzagging faster than the eye could track, breaking every rule of natural light or human-made device. Neighbors gasped. Some fell to their knees in prayer, convinced they were witnessing a sign from heaven. Others ran to fetch guns, though they would not fire them. The most unnerving part, they later agreed, was the silence. No crackling of fire, no hum or wheeze like an engine, no sound at all. Just brilliant light in motion, cutting across the night sky with impossible grace and unnatural calm. Within days, word spread through the hamlets and towns scattered across the Ozarks. In an era without radios or telephones, the story traveled by mouth, letter, and church gatherings. Yet no matter who retold it or how the words were carried, the core remained the same. They had all seen it. Farmers swore the orbs hovered low above barns, glowing bright enough to light the ground yet leaving no mark behind. Hunters who roamed the wooded hills reported lights drifting between trees, so close their rifles felt useless, so strange they dared not chase. A preacher from a nearby township thundered from his pulpit that the lights were divine warnings against sin. At the same time, skeptical neighbors tried to convince themselves they were witnessing nothing but unusual reflections, tricks of eye and atmosphere. Still, disbelief faltered when more and more people began to attest to the same details. The ridge had become a stage for something unknown, undeniable. Among the earliest and most detailed accounts was that of Elias Turner, a logger known for his hard hands and his skepticism of anything he deemed nonsense. Elias had spent decades in the woods, knew every creak of the branches and every sound carried by the hills. He was the last man anyone expected to entertain wild claims. But late one night, while returning alone through Millstone Ridge, he experienced what he would struggle to explain for the rest of his life, according to the letter he wrote years later, found tucked in the back of a family Bible long after his death. Elias had stopped on the ridge when a pale glow crept between the trees. At first he assumed hunters had lit a fire, but within moments the glow solidified into a floating orb of white, followed by two others. They hovered around him at shoulder height, not burning, not flickering, simply glowing with unnatural steadiness. Elias recalled how the hair on his arms stood upright, how the very air seemed colder, though there was no wind. He confessed that his torchlight felt pitiful compared to the radiance near him. The orbs drifted closer, circling slowly as though observing. He fought the urge to swing his axe at them, yet found himself rooted in place, unable to act. The silence pressed on his ears so tightly that he thought he would scream. Then, just as abruptly as they had appeared, the lights shot upward in unison, streaking into the night sky in a sudden burst of speed too fast for human perception. Within seconds they were gone, leaving him trembling and covered in chills. Elias never returned to the ridge at night again, and his account, though private for much of his life, added weight when it eventually surfaced. For if a man so firm and skeptical admitted to such terror, What rational explanation could anyone else hope to give? His letter only fueled curiosity and fear of the ridge. Suddenly, Millstone was no longer a forgotten patch of land. It was a mystery people debated in churchyards and schoolhouses, around market stalls and in distant cabins. Farmers speculated endlessly, some convinced it was a natural wonder yet to be understood, others certain it was supernatural interference. By then, small gatherings of townsfolk began venturing into the dark fields near the ridge, specifically to witness the lights for themselves. They brought lanterns, rifles, Bibles. They came with caution, yet with irresistible curiosity, forming small human clusters shivering in the night air as they waited. More often than not, their patience was rewarded. The lights returned regularly, almost predictably. They appeared in silence, performed their ghostly ballet, and disappeared. Always in the same area, always without leaving a trace. And the longer it went on, the harder it became to dismiss. Scientists of the era had no tools, no photographs, only handwritten accounts. Yet even decades later, the impressive consistency of these reports strikes historians. Unlike myths that mutate with every telling, the ridge lights remain stubbornly identical across generations. Floating spheres, shifting colors, silent glides and sudden darts. Never diversions in the story, never embellishments in detail. Consistency was its own evidence, and it left only more questions than answers. What natural force could create hovering orbs of cold light? What man-made invention could outrun the eye in 1898, when lanterns and oil lamps defined domestic life? And why Millstone Ridge specifically? These questions left the towns divided, caught between fear and fascination. Some continued to frame it as divine punishment. Others began to speculate about magnetic fields, swamp gas, or even hidden fires reflecting against unseen mists. Yet none of these theories matched what so many swore they had seen with clear eyes. The appearance of the ridge lights etched itself deep into the lives of that region. For the older generation, it was an omen. For the younger ones, it was a mystery they longed to unlock. And for all of them, it became something that set their hills apart forever. Because once you looked into the sky over Millstone Ridge, you never looked at darkness the same way again. And as the turn of the 20th century approached, the mystery did not fade but grew. New generations stepped forward, and still the lights returned. The story of the strange phenomenon of Millstone Ridge had only just begun. As weeks turned into months, the strange lights over Millstone Ridge refused to fade into memory. Instead, they returned again and again, as though tethered to the land itself. Some nights they hovered low, drifting lazily like fireflies grown impossibly large. Other nights they blazed high above the treetops, darting faster than bullets in directions no human craft could ever pursue. To those who lived nearby, it became impossible to dismiss them as imagination. The lights were not a fleeting rumor. They were a presence. By the winter of 1898, Millstone Ridge had become the subject of every hushed conversation, from farmhouses to church steps. Families who had once spoken only of weather and harvests now debated the mystery until late into the night. For some, it was a point of dread, proof that the land was cursed or haunted, or touched by forces outside man's grasp. For others, there was an intoxicating pull, a need to witness the phenomenon with their own eyes, to stand beneath that glowing sky and see the inexplicable for themselves. Accounts multiplied. A cattle herder named Samuel Price swore that the lights scattered his herd one frosty morning before dawn, driving animals in every direction as though spooked by an invisible predator. A schoolteacher, Margaret Holt, claimed she saw the lights hovering motionless for nearly an hour as she returned with her brother from a village gathering, their eerie glow reflected in a frozen stream. Margaret, who prided herself on her rational mind, wrote in her journal that she felt as though time itself had slowed while she watched them, her own voice sounding muffled, her heartbeat unnaturally loud. The lights, she noted, filled her with both wonder and dread, as though they were not merely objects in the sky but entities aware of her. It was journals such as hers that preserved the details most vividly. In the absence of photographs or recordings, written words became the record, carried by schoolteachers, preachers, and simple farmers who felt compelled to set their experiences to paper. And while much of rural America paid little attention, in the Ozarks these accounts spread like wildfire. The ridge was whispered about at barn dances, in general stores, so even during sermons where preachers alternated between condemnation and speculation. By early 1899, curious outsiders began to appear. Merchants from Springfield, journalists from St. Louis, and a handful of skeptical academics traveled to the region, hoping either to expose a hoax or to find natural explanations. They arrived carrying notebooks, compasses, and, in rare cases, new Kodak cameras, though the long exposures and primitive film offered little hope of successfully capturing moving lights in the dead of night. One St. Louis reporter stayed a fortnight, publishing a series of articles in which he expressed both doubt and reluctant awe, admitting that groups of witnesses described near-identical events without the contradictions common to hoaxes. Skeptics pointed to swamp gas igniting. Though locals rebutted quickly, there were no swamps near Millstone Ridge. Others suggested atmospheric reflections, yet the lights appeared independently of weather conditions, in rain, in fog, in crisp, cloudless nights. There was no unity of season or pattern beyond their loyalty to that one ridge. The lack of any rational, universally accepted explanation lent the phenomenon an unsettling endurance, because if it was not man-made, and if it was not a known trick of air or gas, then what exactly hovered over their fields and forests? The Ozarks community wrestled with its fear. Farm animals grew uneasy when the lights approached. Roosters crowed at improper hours. Reports accumulated of hunting dogs bolting wildly into the night, refusing to trail game near the ridge. Horses balked, sweating in cold air, eyes rolling white at unseen stimuli. To many, this was the most convincing evidence of all. For animals, unlike men, did not invent lies nor conspire to uphold mysteries. They simply reacted instinctively to forces that unsettled their nature. One night, a gathering of nearly 24 onlookers, including farmers, merchants, and their children, stood together on the southern slope, lanterns lowered, forming a curious congregation beneath the cold stars. They had come to see for themselves. At first, nothing stirred. They whispered among themselves, stamping boots against the frost, half regretting their venture. Then suddenly a glow emerged. The crowd sucked in its breath as a pale sphere slid above the ridgeline, joined quickly by 3 more. The entire group stood frozen as the lights drifted soundlessly overhead. Some later swore they felt a vibration in their chests, not a sound but a sensation, as though the very air quivered. For nearly 15 minutes the orbs glided back and forth before scattering skyward. No one spoke above a whisper until they had vanished. The children wept. Several women fell to their knees, and the merchants from Springfield swore never to return. By spring, the fascination had hardened into an obsession. Some families moved away entirely, unwilling to live beneath phenomena they could not explain. Others clung stubbornly to their homes, determined to endure or even embrace the strangeness. Rumors grew bolder, suggesting that the lights had purpose, that they were signals, that they sought something, or that they were testing the people who witnessed them. Even practical men found themselves unable to deny the emotions the lights stirred within them. It was not mere curiosity. It was unease that lingered for days afterward, as though every witness had been changed in some subtle way. Stranger still were the dreams. Diaries from that era contain accounts of locals reporting vivid, restless nights after their encounters, dreams of endless ridges glowing with fire, of skies overlapping with strange currents of light, of voices half heard through the silence. No one could agree whether these dreams were instilled by the phenomenon itself or were merely the product of minds rattled by exposure to it. Yet as the reports accumulated, one truth remained unavoidable. Millstone Ridge had shifted from a quiet corner of the Ozarks into the epicenter of an enigma, something that would not relent, something that resisted explanation. The whispers grew. Letters describing the lights reached Kansas City, then Chicago, passed hand to hand by those drawn to curiosities beyond the reach of modern science. Though many dismissed them as provincial tall tales, the sheer consistency, even in documents written months apart by people who never crossed paths, disturbed the skeptics. Each account repeated the same essential details: the silence, the hues, the darting movement, the eerie impression that the lights noticed those watching. In the years ahead, patterns would emerge, theories would rise and fall, and the mystery of Millstone Ridge would harden into legend. But in 1899, as the phenomena became impossible to ignore, the people closest to it could sense only one thing. This was no fleeting marvel. The strange lights were not going away. On the contrary, They were becoming part of the land itself, woven into the identity of the Ozarks. And the unanswered question loomed larger with every sighting. If the lights were not the work of nature, and not the work of man, then what had risen above Millstone Ridge on that silent night in 1898? By the dawn of the new century, the mystery of the strange lights over Millstone Ridge could no longer be contained within the Ozarks. What began as a whisper between farmers had swelling into a subject of curiosity that reached state lines. Letters described the phenomenon. Travelers carried tales back to cities hundreds of miles away, and with that spread came the first organized attempts at investigation. The earliest to arrive were journalists. The St. Louis Republic dispatched a correspondent named James Cather in the spring of 1900. Known for his sharp tongue and skeptical ink, Cather expected to expose a simple hoax, something concocted by rural folk eager for attention. His editor urged him to write with bite, to remind city readers of the gullibility of those who lived in the hills. Cather obliged, at least at first. His first reports mocked the phantom flames of Millstone, joking that farmers must be chasing the moon, caught in morning fog. But Cather stayed longer than expected. Each night he joined locals at the edge of the ridge, scribbling notes by lantern light, expecting disappointment. For more than a week, nothing appeared. He argued with farmers that they were exaggerating. But on the 9th night, just as he prepared to fold his notepad, the orbs blazed into sight. Cather froze. His companions pointed skyward as 3 glowing spheres hovered above the tree line, changing colors in measured pulses. He scribbled furiously, noting every movement, how they shifted in patterns not random yet not easily described, how they made no sound even as they darted side to side like hummingbirds. The reporter who had come to laugh grew quiet. His subsequent article struck a different tone, one of reluctant seriousness. "I do not know what I saw," he wrote, "but I know I saw it. And though I long for a rational answer, I can offer none." This article sparked wider curiosity. Soon, professors from the University of Missouri expressed interest. Without funding or proper equipment, their visits were brief, limited to interviews and occasional night watches. The professors returned with little data, but their sober acknowledgement that the witnesses were sincere and aligned in detail did more to fuel the legend than any fanciful exaggeration could have. Rational men admitting they could not dismiss the accounts lent the story a weight impossible to ignore. The locals lived between fascination and fatigue. On the one hand, the lights drew outsiders who brought money, supplies, even newspapers with their names on the front page, something rare in their remote lives. On the other hand, these visitors also disrupted daily routine. Wagons filled narrow roads. Strangers stared into their windows at night, asking questions. And the ridge itself began to feel different, as though it belonged less to the community and more to the strange phenomenon it hosted. Few dared linger on the ridge at night alone anymore. Even the bravest admitted they preferred company in the dark. It was during this period that the first serious folk tales began to form. People whispered of past tragedies that might have cursed the land. A Cherokee burial ground, a massacre during the Civil War, a hermit who died muttering about stars. None of these tales bore documentation, but each told the same thing in different clothes. Millstone Ridge was marked. Something about that land set it apart, and the lights were only the most visible expression of that difference. Though skeptics scoffed, many locals stopped pointing at the ridge casually. They lowered their voices when speaking of it, as if to draw less attention from whatever lingered there. What unsettled investigators most was the unpredictability within the regularity. The lights appeared months on end, then vanished for weeks, only to return suddenly without pattern. Sometimes they hovered peacefully, like lanterns drifting. Other times they darted and weaved, as though responding to onlookers. One farmer recalled shouting angrily at the orbs after they frightened his son and swore they darted closer, circling as if taunting him before streaking away. A woman claimed that when she sang hymns into the night, the lights dimmed briefly, though she admitted it might have been coincidence. Such stories added to the unease, for they suggested not random natural events but a phenomenon with awareness. Still, academics pressed for natural explanations. Some pointed to marsh lights, similar to accounts in Europe of will-o'-the-wisps, gases igniting over wetlands at night. But as locals repeated endlessly, Millstone Ridge had no wetlands. Its hills were rocky, its soil too dry for such formations. Others suggested static electricity, ball lightning, or unknown atmospheric refractions. Those theories comforted some, but the precise consistency of the sightings year after year weighed against easy dismissal. By 1901, Millstone Ridge had become a strange crossroads, a place where farmers labored during the day as though nothing were amiss, but where people gathered at night to hope or fear for the return of the orbs. Gatherings often became community events. Families packed snacks, neighbors brought fiddles, and children huddled close, not knowing whether to laugh, cry, or marvel. There were nights when the ridge felt almost festive, locals waiting in silence with outsiders, all craning their necks toward the sky. And when nothing appeared, they departed disappointed, muttering that the ridge had grown shy. Yet on those nights when the lights did return, the crowd's silence grew so deep it felt as though time itself was holding its breath. In that silence, hearts pounded. In that silence, imaginations stirred. And slowly, people realized the lights were not merely unexplained. They were shaping the very identity of Millstone Ridge and everyone connected to it. The turn of the century thus marked the first division in the story. No longer a local curiosity whispered in fear, the phenomenon had become a matter of record, documented by reporters, academics, and even skeptics who could not dismiss what they had witnessed. And while debates of nature versus mystery raged, one fact remained unshaken. The lights were real. They appeared when they pleased, mocked attempts at prediction, and vanished without explanation. But they were real. The deeper meaning, however, remained elusive. And as 1902 approached, the lights showed no sign of ending. Each return posed the same question, drawing those who gazed into their glow deeper into mystery. What did the lights of Millstone Ridge want? By 1905, Millstone Ridge had grown into more than a geographical landmark. It had become a symbol. For some, it represented wonder, a natural marvel gifted to their quiet corner of the Ozarks. For others, it carried dread, a visible reminder that the world could still conceal forces beyond human comprehension. The strange lights had moved from rumor into memory, from memory into culture. Yet this transformation did not bring unity. If anything, it divided the community more sharply than ever before. On one side were the believers in divine intervention. Preachers from across the hills gathered near the ridge, declaring the lights to be celestial warnings or signs of judgment. Some claimed that the changing colors represented humanity's shifting morality, white for purity, crimson for sin, green for envy and corruption. Congregations swelled with fiery sermons, and families clung tighter to faith, convinced that righteousness was the only shield against whatever roamed their nights. In towns like Buffalo and Lebanon, the phenomenon became sermon fodder every Sunday, turning the ridge into a sacred, almost holy place for pilgrims seeking proof of divine presence. On the other side stood the skeptics. Farmers and merchants chafed at the disruption. Curiosity seekers arrived in growing numbers, clogging roads and trampling fields. Outsiders paid for lodging, but also drained resources and mocked rural accents. Skeptics argued that the lights were a distraction from what mattered: crops, debts, survival. They suspected it was some natural trick, or worse, an elaborate fabrication fueled by exaggeration. They rolled their eyes at sermons and refused to gather at the ridge. For every family that dared spend long nights waiting for orbs to reappear, there was another that refused to speak of it at all. Yet silence could not erase the phenomenon. For no matter how divided the towns grew, the lights returned. They continued to hover and dart, silent and brilliant at irregular intervals, sometimes vanishing for weeks, only to reappear with renewed vigor when least expected. Each sighting reinvigorated the debate, keeping the story alive, refusing to be smothered by denial or scorn. By now, newspapers outside Missouri had begun publishing accounts of the ridge lights. Chicago journals sent correspondence, treating it as a curious amusement, a flavor of rural wonder. Some compared it to the spook lights of Old English folklore. Others hinted it was a uniquely American mystery, a reminder that even in an age of industry and progress, vast tracts of land still kept secrets no man could explain. These articles spread outward like ripples in a pond, each wave stirring more attention, more skepticism, and inevitably more tourism. With this growth came a cultural shift. hotels closer to Springfield began advertising proximity to the ridge. Peddlers sold lanterns and trinkets titled Millstone light charms. Storytellers exaggerated encounters for entertainment, stretching the truth until it snapped. But beneath the bravado, authentic accounts still emerged, simple, raw, consistent. Families describing how the lights hovered above their barns. Hunters admitting their dogs refused to approach trails near the ridge. Groups of children recounting sleepless nights after watching silent orbs dance above their fields. The commercialization could not drown out the honesty of those who had lived with the presence for nearly a decade. However, living with the phenomenon came at a price: tension. Families that once gathered for community suppers or barn raisings now argued bitterly over the meaning of the lights. One neighbor might claim them as signs from God. Another dismissed them as atmospheric reflections. Disagreements grew personal, fraying bonds that had stitched the rural communities together for generations. Even marriages frayed. Diaries from around 1905 tell of husbands mocking wives for lingering by windows, wives scolding husbands for venturing to the ridge at night, children caught in the middle of a debate that no one could win. Oddest of all were the physical effects reported with increasing frequency. Some who ventured closest to the ridge returned feeling nauseated, their skin prickling with tiny shocks, like static electricity. Others claimed persistent headaches and restless dreams after watching the lights. Doctors of the era, few far between and lacking modern instruments, offered no conclusive answers. They wrote it off as nerves, hysteria, or rural superstition. Yet those who felt the sensations knew something greater pressed upon them, some strange force beyond the range of language or science. By 1907, Millstone Ridge was considered both wonder and burden. For every outsider who arrived laughing at legends, there was another who departed shaken, sworn to silence about what they had seen. And for every family thrilled that their hills had captured national attention, there was another that whispered of curses and longed for ordinary, quiet nights again. Still, the lights refused to fade. They did not care for human quarrels. They appeared when they pleased, weaving silently above treetops, reflecting off streams, gliding across the hills, and every time they appeared, they renewed the cycle of awe, fear, and division. This division grew so extreme that in 1908, two churches in a nearby town split over the debate. One group insisted on weekly vigils by the ridge, treating the phenomenon as divine instruction. The other broke away, denouncing obsession as blasphemy, demanding that people abandon the lights and return their focus to Scripture alone. Two churches where there had once been one, born not of scandal or theology, but because of glowing orbs in the night sky. And yet, through all the conflict, wonder endured. For at the heart of the debate, beneath the division and fatigue, was the raw fact that something unexplainable had chosen their ridge. In an era when the world seemed increasingly conquered by railroads, telegraphs, and factories, when the frontier spirit was being locked away behind steel and progress, the hills of the Ozarks held a mystery that refused to bow to human understanding. Children grew up under that shadow, their bedtime stories filled not with fairy tales, but with sightings of the lights. Teenagers dared each other to walk alone on the ridge at night. Families measured years not just in harvests and winters, but also in seasons of the light, when they came often, when they came rarely, when they burst into clusters so dazzling it seemed the heavens had lowered to earth. The ridge lights, as they came to be called, had moved beyond temporary fascination. They had become folklore, woven tightly into the identity of Millstone Ridge and its people. Even skeptics, as much as they mocked, could not deny their place in daily life. The lights were part of the land, as permanent and inexplicable as the hills themselves. But as the years turned toward the second decade of the century, the mystery deepened further. For while the orbs had once seemed neutral, merely hovering, darting, vanishing, they began to change. Observers reported subtler behaviors. The lights appeared to linger longer near groups, sometimes hovering low enough to make faces glow unnaturally pale. They reacted, not always, but often enough to disturb even hardened skeptics. A whistle, a shout, sometimes seemed to draw them closer. Silence often made them drift away. Were they responding? And if so, to what? As this question began to circulate, fascination trembled once more toward fear. Because if the lights responded, if they truly reacted, then perhaps they were not mere accidents of nature after all, Perhaps they carried intention. Perhaps for the first time, the ridge itself was not just a place of spectacle, but a place of contact. And with that realization, the divide grew sharper. For some, proof of wonder was almost too much to bear. For others, proof of dread had finally come true. The stage was set, and the community braced itself for what the next decade would bring. The new century marched forward, and with it came progress. Railroads expanded deeper into Missouri, connecting once isolated towns to broader markets. Telegraph lines hummed with messages of distant business and politics. Automobiles, still rare and noisy, began to rattle along dirt roads, drawing stares from children unused to their mechanical roar. The Ozarks, long defined by isolation, were being nudged into the modern era. And yet, in this era of growing certainty, Millstone Ridge remained untamed, a patch of land where progress bowed before mystery. By the 1910s, the strange lights were no longer dismissed as temporary oddities. They had persisted for over a decade, their appearances too consistent and too widely witnessed to be ignored. The community surrounding Millstone Ridge had entered a new phase in their relationship with the phenomenon: observation. No longer content with speculation, people began to watch deliberately, seeking patterns that might unravel the enigma. Farmers noted the seasons. In their almanacs, they scribbled when the orbs appeared, trying to discover cycles hidden within the nights. Was it more common in winter, when cold air sharpened the stars? Or did the lights favor humid summers, when the ridge steamed with heat after long days of sun? Strangely, no clear seasonal rhythm emerged. The orbs seemed to defy patterns of nature, sometimes dancing in February snow, sometimes blazing across July skies, sometimes refusing for months to appear at all. Their loyalty was not to weather or season, but to place, always the ridge, never beyond others studied time itself. Teachers, preachers, and curious townsfolk began gathering at regular hours, hoping to determine whether the lights returned with nightly precision. Some swore the orbs preferred the hours between 9 and midnight, while others recorded sightings in the dim hours just before dawn. Again and again, the observations contradicted each other. The only commonality was their stubborn unpredictability. The lights appeared only when they chose, unbound by human schedules. It was this elusiveness that fed both skepticism and devotion. Skeptics argued that if the orbs could not be predicted, they might be nothing more than optical illusions, stray reflections mistaken for mystery. Devotees countered that the very unpredictability proved intelligence at work, a deliberate choice to confound human expectations. Both sides grew entrenched, neither willing to yield. Still, written accounts from this era multiplied. Diaries, church records, school journals all contain references. The consistency of detail across so many sources troubled even those who doubted. Each account noted the same traits: hovering, multicolored brilliance, silence, sudden bursts of movement. Even language repeated itself. Orbs, balls of light, glowing spheres. Rarely did anyone describe them in terms that strayed far from those. If this was invention, it was a remarkably disciplined one. During this decade, a few photographers attempted to capture the lights. With cameras evolving beyond crude early Kodaks, longer exposures became possible. Yet the ridge lights mocked their efforts. Orbs that moved too quickly became streaks across failing plates. Those that hovered appeared only faintly, easily mistaken for imperfections in film. The photographs, blurry, indistinct, were dismissed, leaving the community as reliant as ever on eyewitness testimony. Still, the very attempt at photographs marked something important. The lights had shifted from folklore into the realm of attempted science. People were no longer content to tell stories. They wanted proof. Meetings began. Small groups gathered in schoolhouses in towns like Fairgrove and Marshfield, where locals debated the phenomenon with structured formality. Committees of observation formed, logging when and where sightings occurred. Though the methods were unpolished and the tools limited, the kernel of research had been planted. Millstone Ridge was not just mystery. It was becoming data. And yet, for all the writing, for all the careful watching, the lights resisted explanation. Each theory collapsed under the weight of contradiction. Ball lightning left no accounts of duration such as minutes, even hours. Swamp gas required swamps. Reflections needed sources of light, yet the orbs glowed from within, unshaken by lanterns or starlight. The more carefully people thought, the more deeply unsettled they became. Meanwhile, everyday life continued. Children still walked miles to schoolhouses. Farmers still rose before dawn, tending cattle and ploughing soil. The ridge remained farmland and woodland, indistinguishable by daylight from 100 other patches across the Ozarks. But at night it became something else entirely. It became a theater of silence and awe, an eternal reminder that not all questions bowed to progress. It was during these years that outsiders coined a phrase still used in whispers: the lights of Millstone. Unlike earlier dismissive phrases, phantom flames and hillfire, this one carried weight and respect. It was simple, precise, and enduring. The lights of Millstone. And with that name came permanence. Whatever they were no longer just a murmur of terrified farmers. They were recognized phenomenon, a title belonging to the folklore of America. But not every recognition brought comfort. Divisions within the community sharpened. Those who feared the lights more insisted on avoiding them entirely, spreading tales of illness, nightmares, and missing livestock. Others embraced them, treating them as almost protective, a sign that their ridge had been chosen for marvel. Either way, the lights had embedded themselves so firmly in daily thought that ignoring them became impossible. One could debate them, one could fear them. One could mock them, but one could not erase them. And still new layers of mystery accumulated. By 1912, witnesses described orbs appearing in groups more often than before. 5, 6, sometimes more in clustered formation. They did not always hover uniformly. Larger orbs seemed to dominate, pulsing brighter, while smaller ones drifted carefully alongside. Speculations grew bolder. Were they alive? Were they guided? Did these larger orbs carry purpose, while the smaller ones merely followed? No one could answer. But the fact remained. The phenomenon showed change, as if evolving with time. This evolution alarmed the towns. What had once been a curious oddity now threatened to feel like escalation. People whispered, what did it mean that the lights multiplied? What path lay ahead if their numbers swelled? With every unanswered question, imagination filled the void. And imagination, for all its richness, bred equal parts fascination and fear. By the midpoint of the decade, the lights of Millstone Ridge were not just sights in the sky. They were patterns in the lives of those below. Patterns of divided belief. Patterns of collected testimony. Patterns of awe and dread stitched into every retelling. Though science could not contain them, life itself was being reshaped around their glow. And as the Great War loomed in Europe, voices in the Ozarks could not help but wonder. In an age when nations tore each other apart with machines, might the lights above Millstone Ridge be reminders that humanity still faced mysteries it could not manufacture, nor control? The lights refused to answer. They only returned, glowing in silence, hovering over a ridge that by now had abandoned every hope of being ordinary again. The world beyond the Ozarks was changing faster than ever. By 1914, newspapers bursting into local towns carried stories not of crops or state fairs, but of looming conflict across the Atlantic. Europe was tearing itself apart in a war described with words few in rural Missouri had ever heard: trench, artillery, gas. For families living in the shadow of Millstone Ridge, these words were distant, foreign, and abstract. But the war, like the lights that haunted their hills, became part of their daily rhythm soon enough. By 1917, America itself had entered the conflict, pulling young men from farms and fields into uniforms, sending them across an ocean most had never imagined crossing. And alongside the sorrow of boys leaving home came a strange twist. The way people began to speak of the ridge lights changed. What had once been dismissed as superstition or embraced as divine now began to be cast in the shadow of war. Conversations around church steps and shop counters echoed with uneasy comparisons. Some whispered that the orbs were omens, warnings of blood soon to be spilled. Others went further still, spreading rumors that the lights were a kind of signal, a strange communication between forces invisible. Just as telegraphs carried messages in codes unseen, even newspapers carried those echoes. In Springfield, editorials suggested that the world was entering an era of hidden powers, where technology amplified human ambition to terrifying scale. Was it so impossible, these writers asked cautiously, that forces of equal mystery might appear in the sky over Millstone Ridge? If men had invented flying machines, strange contraptions reported in Europe before the war, could not stranger forces be at work beyond humanity's reach? When the war touched home, grief carved deeper into the ridge's mystery. Mothers who received letters about sons, lost at the Marne or in faraway Flanders, began connecting their loss with the lights. In diaries, some wrote that each time the ridge glowed, they felt it was tied to tragedy abroad. A widow in Fairgrove, whose son never returned from France, wrote that she saw the orbs 2 nights before being notified of his death. A coincidence, perhaps, but one she clung to as confirmation. For her, the lights became companions of grief, not tormentors, but reflections of the sorrow carried by the land. Meanwhile, soldiers returning from the war brought with them new stories. They had witnessed artillery shells bursting in unnatural light, skies scarred by flares and fire. To some of them, the phenomenon of Millstone Ridge seemed less frightening compared to the bombardments of Europe. "I saw skies over Flanders glow brighter than this ridge ever could," one veteran declared at a community meeting in 1919, dismissing the fear outright. But others returned carrying deeper unease, claiming that the glow of shells at night felt disturbingly similar to the orbs of home, a similarity that filled their dreams with confusion. Was the ridge foreshadowing what men themselves would unleash? It was in this era that the suggestion of contact deepened. Townsfolk had long whispered that the lights reacted to sound, movement, or prayer. Now emboldened by technologies like radios, some began to experiment deliberately. A small group of younger men, restless after returning from war, carried lanterns, flags, even makeshift signals up the ridge, waving them into the night. Locals later said the lights shifted once, drifting closer, before vanishing suddenly. Whether that was coincidence or not, it became the root of yet another rumor, that the ridge lights could see. And if they could see, then surely they could understand. But rather than soothing, that suggestion provoked deeper unease. If the orbs carried intention, whose intention was it? A human one tied to machines of war and new sciences? Or something entirely different, forces uninterested in the struggles of men yet drawn to their hills for reasons unknown? The community itself grew weary under so many questions. Between the fatigue of war and the mystery of the ridge, families longed for peace, for silence unbroken by glowing skies or telegrams of death. Yet each time they thought the phenomenon might fade, the orbs returned, haunting them with cold persistence. By the early 1920s, Millstone Ridge was no longer just a regional story. Travelers from Kansas City and even Chicago ventured specifically to witness the phenomenon. Academics, newly emboldened by advances in electricity and physics, proposed complex hypotheses: electrical discharges in the atmosphere, piezoelectric effects caused by pressure in bedrock. These words meant little to locals, who cared less about scientific jargon and more about the fact that decade after decade, their nights remained filled with lights that no one could command. The contrast between ordinary life and extraordinary events defined the era. The ridge by day was no different than any other Ozark landscape: men tending fences, women hanging laundry, children running barefoot through grass. But by night it became something unmatched, an open-air theater where the sky unfolded mysteries no man could chart. Soldiers had seen war machines. Towns had seen technology. Yet Millstone Ridge had seen something else altogether, something neither weapon nor machine, something beyond. Folklore continued to grow. Ballads woven by fiddlers spoke of glowing orbs wandering the hills like ghostly guardians or wandering souls. Old men muttered about Cherokee curses, tying the lights to injustices of history. Women whispered of protective presences, claiming the lights had spared them from accidents or guided lost children home. But always the pattern returned to the same ambiguity. No one knew their purpose. No one could deny their presence. This enduring silence, the refusal of the lights to deliver meaning, made them stronger than any sermon or theory. They were, in their own way, invulnerable. Wars raged. Men built machines that flew, radio waves pierced oceans. Yet Millstone Ridge lights returned as they always had, untouched, unchanging in their defiance of explanation. And it was precisely that defiance that drew people back, year after year. For in a world that believed it could explain everything, through industry, war, technology, and progress, the ridge stood as a reminder that not all mysteries bowed to proof. Some remained glaring silently in the night, patient as stone, waiting for generations to pass while they remained unchanged. For the people of the Ozarks, the Great War had brought both loss and modernity. But in its shadow, Millstone Ridge grew in stature, pulling its mystery tighter into the fabric of their lives. No longer just a local curiosity, it had become an enduring enigma, one that refused to disappear even in the face of the greatest war the world had yet seen. And as the new decade approached, one question echoed louder than before. If the lights of Millstone Ridge were patient enough to outlast wars and nations, what exactly were they waiting for? The 1920s arrived like a storm across America. Cities pulsed with jazz, prohibition pushed liquor into hidden rooms, and machines of every kind reshaped daily life. Automobiles rattled confidently down roads once dirt and mud. Radios filled parlors with voices from hundreds of miles away. Motion pictures flickered into theaters, drawing crowds who laughed, cried, and gasped at stories carried not by words alone, but by light itself. Yet in Missouri's Ozarks, where the soil still dictated survival and towns clung tightly to their rhythms, progress came slower. The crackle of jazz might echo faintly from a radio in a general store. The rumble of a Ford passing through town might turn heads, but the lives of farmers still depended on weather and land. At night, when the radios went quiet and traffic eased, silence reclaimed the hills. It was in that silence that the strange phenomenon of Millstone Ridge continued to thrive. What had once been whispered as divine or cursed was now, in the 1920s, increasingly spoken of as scientific mystery. With newspapers eager to capture the appetite for discovery that marked the age, the ridge lights began receiving mention alongside stories of flight, invention, and astronomy. The idea that human progress could soar into the skies with airplanes made the notion of strange aerial lights less absurd and somehow more possible. If men could put machines into the air, some reasoned, perhaps Millstone's orbs were some peculiar byproduct of forces not yet explained by physics. Scientific language began invading local discussion. Words like radiation, electrical discharge, and atmospheric ionization filtered in through pamphlets, magazines, and lecturers traveling from universities. Most of the Ozark farmers did not comprehend the details, yet the terminology itself gave the mystery new weight. It was no longer just lights. They might be connected to forces of nature, only freshly charted by men like Edison and Tesla. In this way, the ridge lights stepped into modernity with everyone else. Still, for those who lived closest to the ridge, the lights refused to become merely academic. They continued their appearances, erratic, breathtaking, unnerving. Nights of dazzling displays were followed by weeks of silence. Families grew accustomed to the unpredictable pattern. Some even began to weave the phenomenon into their lives with less fear than before. Children dared each other to camp at the ridge. Teenagers whispered about the lights during late-night walks, finding romance in the strangeness. A handful of lovers claimed the orbs appeared when they kissed beneath the stars, as if blessing their vows. But alongside these softer tales rose darker undercurrents. By mid-decade, a few missing persons reports from nearby towns stirred unease. A hunter who never came home, a boy who claimed he would see the lights up close one night, only to vanish without trace. Authorities chalked such disappearances to wilderness hazards, ravines, rivers, wild animals. Yet among neighbors, whispers painted another conclusion. The ridge lights weren't just watching anymore. They were calling. Stories swirled from those who had walked too close. One farmer's wife told of a cousin who collapsed after standing beneath a hovering orb. His skin, she recalled, was clammy, his pulse faint. He recovered within hours, but never spoke of it again. Another tale described a pair of men who insisted they had heard a low hum accompany the lights for the first time. A vibration deep enough to rattle their teeth, though no one else in the group reported the sound. Such inconsistencies made skeptics scoff, but to the believers, they marked proof that the phenomenon was intensifying. Meanwhile, the 1920s taste for sensation, for headlines bold and dramatic, ensured that Millstone Ridge remained talked about far beyond Missouri. In Chicago, a magazine ran a feature titled America's Mystery Lights, Our Own Ghostly Skies. It lumped Millstone together with other tales from the South and Great Plains, ghost lights, spook lights, mysterious flames that defied reason. Readers in bustling cities consumed the stories as entertainment, thrills to pair with jazz records and speakeasy rumors. But for those living in the shadow of the ridge, it was not entertainment. It was nightly reality. Journalists and curiosity seekers poured in. Some came genuine, carrying notebooks and cameras. Others were thrill chasers, looking to brag of encounters. Their arrival irritated locals, yet also brought money and novelty into towns otherwise untouched by glitz. Small diners sold Ridgelight coffee. Inns hung signs pointing the way to America's glowing wonder. The commercialization frustrated elders, but younger generations embraced it, delighted that their hills had become more than forgotten farmland. Still, in quiet kitchens and late-night porches, locals spoke in softer tones. Too many whispered diaries told of disturbed sleep, of dreams that mirrored the lights too closely. Women described dreaming of spheres drifting through their rooms at night. Men woke sweating, insisting they had heard footsteps beneath a yawning glow. Rational minds dismissed it as worry or imagination sparked by overexposure to journalists. But others clung to them as warnings. The phenomenon was not benign. It was creeping closer, into the lives of those who lived under its glow. As the decade roared forward, one detail marked the lights as different from their earlier years. They lingered longer. Witnesses spoke of orbs hovering for half an hour, sometimes nearly an hour, with steady pulses of crimson or green that dappled fields in eerie glow. They no longer seemed fleeting or bashful. They were steady, patient, as if testing how long they could hold their place in the human gaze. And then came 1927, a summer remembered distinctly. Nearly 40 people gathered on a ridge slope one balmy night, lured by rumors of frequent sightings. They sat in silence, lanterns low. At first, only stars filled the sky. Then, without whisper or warning, 6 brilliant orbs rose together. Unlike earlier nights of darting and weaving, this display was unified. The 6 hovered in a formation, almost geometric, pulsing in synchronization. The crowd gasped. Some cried out. A preacher fell to the ground, certain that judgment had come. Children clung to their parents, while journalists feverishly snapped photographs. For 30 minutes the lights remained, utterly motionless save for their pulses. Then together they blinked out. The event sparked headlines. Skeptics argued furiously. Tricks of reflection, group hysteria, electrical storms. But those who were present insisted there had been no storm. No reflection, no possibility of illusion shared equally by a crowd that large. And thus the lights carved deeper into legend. By the close of the decade, Millstone Ridge had earned recognition nationwide. It appeared in travel brochures, in folklore collections, in scientific journals fumbling for hypotheses. And with every mention the question deepened. What force kept this corner of the Ozarks bathed in a glow no man could chase away? The 1920s were loud, hurried, filled with progress. Yet in the quiet hills of Missouri, silence still reigned, broken only by the shimmer of orbs no radio could explain, no engine could reach, no scientist could conquer. And as the decade waned, locals learned this lesson well. While men believed they had mastered the modern world, the lights of Millstone Ridge remained masters of the night. The crash of 1929 sent shockwaves across America, and even into the remote hills of the Ozarks, far from Wall Street and banks of marble. By the early 1930s, hardship was no longer reserved for distant headlines. Farmers at Millstone Ridge felt it in their empty barns, in the shriveling markets where crops fetched pennies, in the hollow look of neighbors losing not just money, but pride. Hunger made its way into kitchens. Livestock dwindled. Futures felt more fragile than ever. The ridgelights, once regarded as spectacle or omen, took on new meaning in this struggle. They had haunted the community for decades, but during the Depression, their presence grew sharper, heavier, infused with a symbolism people could not ignore. In the leanest years, when bread was rationed and debt suffocated, many looked skyward and found not only terror but also solace in the silent orbs. Some whispered that the lights were guardians, that as long as they hovered, the ridge would endure, no matter how cruel the economy turned. "If the lights can still shine," one woman wrote in her diary in 1932, "perhaps we too will find a way to shine again." For her, and for many like her, the lights became a strange comfort, an assurance that, even in darkness, something constant endured. Others, however, grew bitter at their persistence. If they come from heaven, one farmer muttered. "Then they'd do better to feed a family than waste glow on the trees." In times of scarcity, mystery loses luxury. For some, the ridge lights were no longer wonder but insult, proof of forces beyond control that seemed to mock their struggle as silent fires danced in skies they could not eat. At night gatherings, the tone shifted from fascination to grim determination. Families still came, not out of joy but out of habit, as if waiting under the lights together reminded them of community, of neighbors who had not disappeared. They spoke less, laughed less, but still they came. And the lights answered in their way, appearing steadily throughout those years, sometimes brighter, sometimes softer, but always present, always hovering above a world that seemed crumbling below. Interestingly, researchers who ventured during these harsh times noticed something peculiar. The accounts of the lights grew more intense, more emotional, even as their physical descriptions never wavered. They were still described as orbs, silent and glowing, shifting between white, green, and crimson. But in the telling, witnesses imbued new meaning. The crimson hue came to symbolize blood, the white purity, the green envy of those who had little against those with more. Whether projections of a desperate population or true reflections of change, the lights seemed to mirror human struggle, shifting in step with the times. Folklore deepened as well. Old songs written during the Depression sometimes slipped the ridge lights into their verses. Ballads of hardship and poverty included lines about fires in the sky that won't warm no stone hearth. Children sang rhymes comparing hunger to glowing orbs that offered no bread. The phenomenon had become part of the language of endurance, a fixture not only of the night, but of the cultural psyche of the Ozarks. That decade also carried whispers of more daring close encounters. A woodcutter's family claimed that during one bitter winter, they saw an orb drift low across their field, so close that snow glowed emerald in its wake. The children swore they felt its heat on their faces, though their father denied warmth. For weeks afterward, the family insisted they heard faint humming in their walls at night. Skeptics dismissed such claims as malnutrition's hallucinations. Yet among hungry families who lived it, stories grew like weeds, tying the lights ever closer to their lives. As hardships pressed tighter, so too did superstition. Some began leaving small offerings at the ridge, loaves of bread gone stale, coins too few to matter, hoping the lights might bring luck in return. While the church dismissed such gestures as pagan folly, the desperation behind them was undeniable. To those who offered, it was less about religion and more about bargaining with mystery, appealing to whatever lingered in the sky to intercede. Whether placebo or true belief, those same families swore that after leaving offerings, their seasons turned slightly kinder, their debts slightly eased. Others accused them of blasphemy, further deepening divisions within the strained community. Yet one truth endured: the Great Depression bound the ridge lights more deeply into the life of Millstone than ever before. For even those who claimed to despise their glow could not banish them. Each evening the lights might return, visible proof that even in the grimmest era, something beyond comprehension remained alive. They had become more than mystery. They were endurance itself. By the late 1930s, when whispers of war again stirred across the ocean, the ridge lights seemed almost prophetic. Young men, children during the Great 20s sightings, now grew restless beneath their strange glow. They talked differently about the orbs, not as curses or comforts, but as symbols of inevitability. "The world's burning up out there," one said in 1938, "and those lights have been warning us all along." Others disagreed, claiming the orbs were reminders that no matter how violent men became, nature, or whatever force drove them, remained greater still. The coming of the Second World War would bring new interpretations. But during the Depression, the lights were mirrors. Mirrors of hunger, mirrors of desperation, mirrors of hope. They reflected all that people carried inside, giving shape to fears words could not always express. Yet in their essence, they remained unchanged, silent, glowing, indifferent to Wall Street or drought, patient beyond comprehension, hovering faithfully above Millstone Ridge, as men and women below weathered the longest storm of their earthly lives. And so, as the 1930s drew to a close, the ridge lights had etched themselves not only into local legend, but into resilience itself. They were no longer just unexplained phenomena. They were partners in survival, A reminder that while men could fall, mystery would endure, waiting silently above the trees. By 1939, as distant Europe ignited once again in conflict, the Ozarks remained quiet, still and insulated. The ridge lights were still appearing, steady and unsolved, but not nearly as significant as the mounting concerns overseas. Headlines spoke of invasions, of air raids, of machines filling skies with brutality. For families near Millstone Ridge, the echoes of the First World War were returning with cruel familiarity. Sons would be sent away again, daughters would watch homes grow emptier, and uncertainty would linger heavily over dinner tables. Yet as war crept closer, so did new meaning for the ridge lights. Now, in an age where airplanes dominated battle, where bombers unleashed fire across European cities, the appearance of mysterious lights in American skies struck a chord. Were they warnings? Were they somehow connected to a world drenched in conflict? Or were they a reminder that the scope of human invention, as terrifying as it now appeared, remained small when compared to the silent brilliance above Millstone Ridge? As America formally entered the war in 1941, the interpretations shifted again. That winter following Pearl Harbor, locals reported a surge of ridge light appearances. Several nights in December saw multiple orbs flickering over the trees, glowing crimson and white against the frost. The timing struck deep nerves. People whispered that the lights had answered the bloodshed, that their crimson hue was tied to the deaths carried across the ocean. For many, the connection was superstition. For others, it was impossible to ignore. Young men leaving for the war wrote letters later recalling the lights as omens. "I swear they hovered the night before I left," wrote one soldier in 1942, as if they knew we'd be gone. For others, the ridge lights represented a promise that no matter how far they traveled, something constant remained at home, something immune to death, to war, to despair. They drew solace from the thought that the orbs would still hang above Millstone, silent and steadfast, waiting for them on their return. Strangely enough, it was not just locals who used such imagery. During the war, a handful of traveling reporters seeking fresh, hopeful, or unusual stories published features on Millstone Ridge. "Even in wartime, mystery glows at home," one article read. Photographs of the ridge appeared beside stories of battles in the Pacific and Europe. Though not evidence in any scientific sense, the articles served as reminders that mystery persisted even on American soil, far from the bombs. At the same time, suspicion sharpened. Some raised the question outright: what if the lights were not supernatural nor unexplained but mechanical? The era of aviation had erased the innocence of unexplained lights. No longer could they be dismissed as stars or swamp gas alone. Could the ridge lights, some asked nervously, be tests? Machines flown deliberately? Unknown experiments conducted in utmost secrecy? In bars and quiet suppers, locals speculated that the government knew more, that perhaps Millstone Ridge had been chosen for some hidden purpose. Secrecy became as strong a theme as superstition. Meanwhile, veterans who returned on leave brought unsettling comparisons. Many had witnessed Foo Fighters, mysterious orbs of light reported by Allied pilots in Europe and the Pacific. These accounts, strange balls of fire that followed planes, darted erratically and vanished suddenly, bore uncanny resemblance to the ridge lights. When stories of these wartime sightings reached Missouri, they struck the community like thunder. Could the lights seen in their own hills be the same phenomena, haunting pilots halfway across the world? If so, the mystery was not confined to Millstone Ridge after all. It was part of something larger, something global. For skeptics, this widened their dismissal. It was simply atmospheric phenomena, explainable in universal terms of pressure, electricity, or fire. For believers, however, it confirmed their deepest conviction. The ridge lights were not isolated curiosities. They were manifestations of forces older, greater, and perhaps intelligent, forces reaching across continents in times of greatest turmoil. The war strained not just nations, but local lives. Families watched new generations march off, many not to return. Each telegram of loss cut deeper into the fabric of the Ozarks. And intertwined with grief came memory of the lights. More than one mother claimed they had appeared outside her home the very night her son was killed abroad. Many refused to dismiss such coincidences as chance. Grief demanded meaning, and meaning demanded connection. For those who survived, returning home was marked by awe mixed with weariness. When veterans gathered under the ridge lights once more, many described them less as frightening and more as familiar, almost comforting. "Better these lights than tracer fire," one veteran muttered, watching orbs flicker silently where once artillery had split the sky. In this comparison, the mystery of Millstone was a reminder of nature's silence against man's destruction. As the war ended in 1945, so did the atmosphere of desperate urgency. Families embraced victories, mourned losses and tried to sew ordinary life back together. Yet the ridge lights remained unchanged, as they had been through drought, depression and war. Their constancy was uncanny. The world seemed to shift beneath them. Progress, violence, invention. But above Millstone Ridge, the same silent orbs continued to float, gliding as though untouched by history. Folklore changed tone after the war. The ridge lights were spoken of less with fear and more with reverence, even nostalgia. They had been present during despair. They had hovered when soldiers departed, appeared when telegrams arrived, glowed when survivors returned. Whether omen or comfort, they had been part of life's most trying chapter. New stories described them as guardians, as quiet companions, bearing witness to both the worst and best of human resilience. Still, the question of truth remained unanswered. Were they atmospheric? Electrical? Something human hidden from public knowledge? Or something else entirely? Post-war science pressed forward at an astonishing pace: nuclear power, rockets, radar. The world was learning to bend forces unseen. And yet here in the Ozarks, the simplest of mysteries defied explanation. And perhaps that was why they endured, because in a world increasingly explained by equations, a world building rockets to breach the stratosphere, the ridge lights remained one corner no formula could claim. They glowed not with the smoke of factories or the roar of machines, but with a silence that no man could replicate. The war had revealed many truths about mankind, its capacity for innovation, its capacity for destruction. But it had revealed nothing about the ridge, and so, as peace settled briefly across the land, Millstone Ridge continued to wait, its skies carrying orbs that remained exactly as they had been in 1898, constant, mesmerizing, maddeningly unexplained. Decades passed, and the world shifted. The middle of the 20th century marched into its latter half with dizzying speed. Rockets climbed into orbit. Men walked on the moon. Computers shrank from sprawling machines into boxes that fit in ordinary homes. The age of explanation, so it was called, brought the assumption that no mystery was safe. Science would conquer all. And yet, in the quiet hills of Missouri, the ridge lights still appeared. They had outlasted 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the roar of the 20s, and the sorrow of the 30s. They emerged into a new era of satellites, televisions, and nuclear age wonder, with no less confidence than before. Farmers in the 1950s wrote of seeing the orbs after an evening harvest, the same descriptions as in 1898. Teenagers in the 1960s, driving cars to meeting spots by the ridge, whispered of streaks of crimson and emerald hovering over the tree line before vanishing into the night. Hikers in the 1970s scribbled in journals, describing their unease as glowing spheres floated just 20 feet overhead. Time changed the instruments in men's hands, but not the mystery above their heads. By then, researchers with better tools had taken renewed interest. Cameras grew sharper, film improved. Yet photographs, though clearer, still betrayed the same problem. Orbs appeared indistinct, glowing against black skies with no defining shape. To skeptics, they could just as easily be lanterns, headlights, tricks of long exposure. To witnesses, the photos were always disappointing. None could capture what the human eye saw: the pulse, the color shift, the eerie silence pressing into the skin like pressure from the air itself. In the 1980s and 90s, the ridge lights began attracting the attention of a new kind of visitor, enthusiasts of aerial phenomena. At the same time, people across the world debated sightings of strange objects in the sky. Millstone Ridge was drawn into that larger narrative. Articles connected the phenomenon to lights seen in New Mexico, orbs in Australia, luminous displays in Scandinavia. But for locals, the ridge lights felt older, more personal. They did not look like machines. They did not move like crafts. They did not roar or hum. They hovered, pulsed, and vanished. Their silence, more than anything, set them apart. Interestingly, locals often resisted when outsiders framed the orbs as something extraterrestrial. In the Ozarks, the ridge lights had never been aliens or spaceships. They were something else, something woven into their land, as old as the trees, as patient as the hills. Outsiders could speculate freely. For those who had grown up under them, the lights belonged not to outer space but to Millstone itself. As the 21st century dawned, technology made it easy to capture video, and dozens of shaky recordings found their way online. Small crowds gathered each year, phones lifted into the dark, hoping to record the phenomenon that had humbled cameras for a century. Some clips showed faint glows drifting above treetops, fueling debates across the internet. Others captured little more than shadows. And still, despite millions of viewers worldwide, the lights resisted the same things they always had: proof, explanation, submission to clarity. Strangely enough, with time, they became as much about identity as about evidence. For the people of the Ozarks, Millstone Ridge no longer required outside recognition. The lights were theirs. They had outlived fads, survived skepticism, and endured every attempt to mold them into convenient answers. The ridge lights were part of who they were, a reminder that their home carried mystery no textbook could capture. Every generation revived the same rhythm. Children were told stories by firelight. Teenagers dared each other to hike into the ridge at midnight. Adults laughed skeptically until one night they saw the glow for themselves, then fell silent. Even in a world of endless distraction, where glowing screens filled every hand, the ridge light still had power. To see one hovering just above the trees was to feel ancient again, small, human in the truest sense. Historians reviewing old records are struck most by one detail: the consistency. From 1898 to modern times, the descriptions barely waver. Always orbs, always color-shifting, always silent. Generations of wars, economies, and inventions had changed the world, yet the light stood outside time. Their silence mocked both superstition and science, reminding all who looked up that some things refused neat categories. And so today, Millstone Ridge still carries its fire. On clear nights, people gather just as they once did in 1898. Lanterns replaced by cell phones, wagons replaced by cars, but the posture unchanged. They wait quietly, staring at a sky that may or may not comply. Hours pass. Sometimes nothing appears, and they depart shaking heads, laughing at wasted evenings. Other times the orbs rise suddenly from the tree line, glowing, pulsing, dancing as before. Conversations fall silent. Words dry up, and the awe feels as new as it did at the very beginning, because in its essence, the ridge lights are not about explanation, they are about experience. The gasp when they first appear, the silence that overtakes the crowd, the way children clutch parents' sleeves, the way adults stand frozen against their better judgment. It is not about knowing, it is about seeing. Over 100 years after they first startled a quiet community in 1898, the ridge lights remain unsolved. Were they gases igniting against unknown minerals, or piezoelectric discharges caused by hidden faults in the land? Were they manifestations of atmospheric energy, or reminders that landscapes can carry secrets older than memory? No consensus has ever been reached. Some refuse to believe they exist at all, dismissing every account as exaggeration. Others stake their lives on their reality, but through all the doubt and all the belief, the orbs continue to rise. Over farms that have changed hands, over families that have come and gone, over generations that built lives beneath them, they remain unchanged, silent, brilliant, inexplicable. The strange lights over Millstone Ridge are more than folklore now. They are history. A century of testimony binds them into permanence. Whether considered science, superstition, or symbol, they have outlasted every effort to erase them. As modern visitors leave the ridge at night, some whisper a question that has haunted every generation before: do the lights watch us, or do they wait for us? The answer lies not in records or experiments, but in the silence between pulses, in the flicker above the trees, in the fact that, after more than a century, they are still there, quenching doubt with presence alone. The strange lights rose first in 1898, above a quiet Ozark ridge no one expected to remember. Today, Millstone Ridge is remembered because of them, and so long as they continue unbroken, unexplained, the world will keep watching, waiting, wondering what truly hovers above Millstone Ridge. Have you noticed how every family hides secrets that seem to whisper from the past? Here, We uncover buried stories, family curses, and mysteries many would rather silence. But if you've made it this far, it means you feel that same chilling curiosity that holds you captive. Don't let these voices fade away. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow each new case we bring every week. Join a community that isn't afraid to face the darkest side of history. Get ready, the next secrets are already waiting to be told.